Parshas B'haloscha. Vayihi ben Soharon, Vayomer Moshe. So that song is pretty familiar to many people who will daven in a shul that sings, a Balabatisha shul, where they sing that, and Kuma Hashem v'yafutzu oivecha v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha. So these words comes from this week's Parsha. It's Perek Yud, I believe. Yes. Perek Yud, Psukim, Lamed Hey, and Lamed Vav. That's 10, 35, 36. So we have two questions about this. First of all, the verses themselves are marked off with funny symbols, funny in the sense of unusual or strange. If you look here in this Tanakh, you'll see that there's an upside down nun in this space, and there's an upside down nun in this space. These separate, they mark these two verses that we just sang, or at least that we sang most of. And the question is, why are there these symbols, these upside down nuns? When I was a kid growing up in Detroit, we used to play Chumash baseball, and if you would get an upside down nun, it was worth a lot of points. I don't recall how many points it was, but it's unusual. It doesn't show up anywhere else. And another question is, why are these verses here? The Gemara in Masechah Shabbos asks about the simanim, about these signs, the nuns. It doesn't refer to as a nun. As a matter of fact, it just says simonios, which is demarcations. And it's interesting that the Marshal, the Chochmas Shlomo, says that if there's a letter marking the separation, the Sefer Torah is actually not kosher. It's puzzle because we're not allowed to have any extra letters. We apparently, in most Sefer Torah that I'm familiar with, it has the upside down nun specifically. So evidently we don't paskin, we don't rule like the Chochmas Shlomo. Why is it there? So it's there to show you to something. What's the something? Well, here's the next question. The next question is, what are these verses doing here? If we look at the context leading up to these verses is talking about how Moshe tells his father-in-law, stick around, don't leave, you can be a guide for us. And it says, Vayusu Mehar Hashem, they traveled, the children of Israel traveled from the mountain of God, that's Mount Sinai, Har Sinai. They're going a trip of 3 days, and the Ark of the Covenant of Hashem travels with them, also Derech Shloshis Yomim, for this 3-day journey, to check out a camping place. Vanan Hashem alehem yomam benasam min hamachane, and the cloud of Hashem was on them as they traveled. And then it says, Vayihi ben Soharon, and when the ark traveled, Vayomer Moshe, and Moshe would say, arise. That's what we sang earlier. Kuma Hashem, arise Hashem v'yafutzu oivecha, and your enemies will be scattered, and they will flee. Ve'yunusu misanecha mipanecha uvnucho yomar, and when he returned it, when it would be placed to rest, then he said, Shuv Hashem rivos alfei Yisrael, reside tranquilly, O Hashem, among the myriad thousands of Israel. And then the Torah goes on to say, Vayhi ha'am kimison nimra, and the people complained, they weren't happy with the mun, etc. And Rashi says, why these simonim in the Gemara, based on the Gemara, and the Gemara says this isn't the place of these two verses. These two verses would be most appropriately stated in the second chapter of Bamidbar, which talks about the moving of the Mishkan and the moving of the Ohel Moed, Perek Beis. And it would say, then, it should also say, Vayhi ben Soharon, and when the ark traveled, then they said, etc. So what's this doing here? So the Gemara says that the letters show these symbols, the simonios, the upside down nuns or the reverse nuns, they show that this isn't the place. They mark off these two sentences, this paragraph, if you will, of not thematically consistent content. It's here to separate between two punishments. Bein Puranius lahafsik, bein Puranius lePuranius. So what are the punishments that we're talking about? So the Gemara says, Shnia, the second one is Vayiha Kimsonanim. People were acted like complainers. And then there was Vayishma Hashem Vayicharapo, and Hashem heard, and he got angry. Vativar Bam Eish Hashem Vatochel B'Tzei Machane, and there was a fire that came and seared the fringes of the camp. In other words, it was a punishment, a divine punishment from God. Okay, and what's the first paranus? So the first paranus, the first one, that's the second one. What's the first one in between the two that these Vayiben Soa Psukim are separating? The first one is Vayisu Mehar Hashem. They traveled from Har Hashem. How's that a punishment? How's that even a bad thing? I mean, you got to travel. So the Tosafos points out that it says Vayisu Mehar Hashem. What's Har Hashem? What's the mountain of God? The mountain of God is Mount Sinai. They traveled from Mount Sinai, but it doesn't say they traveled from Mount Sinai. It doesn't say Vayisu Mehar Sinai. It doesn't say Vayisu Mechorev. It says Vayisu Mehar Hashem. They traveled from the mountain of God. In other words, there was some element of deliberateness in leaving the mountain of God. And Tosafos says, based on Chazal, Katino Kaboreach Mi Beis HaSefer, that the children of Israel traveled like kids who flee, who are running when school is over. In other words, the bell rings, we're out of here. We're gone. Let's go. Let's play. Recess. It's Haboreach Mi Beis HaSefer. So the language of Mehar Hashem implies that it was because it was Har Hashem, because it was the mountain of God that they ran. So Schwab asks the question, okay, I understand the second punishment. The second punishment is the fire came down and consumed some of the people. I get it. That's a legit divine punishment. What's the punishment of Vayisu Mehar Hashem? Derech Shloshos Yomim, which immediately precedes this. What is the punishment? Schwab says their distancing themselves is in itself a punishment. And he says that there are certain sins where the sin itself is the punishment. For example, he says, somebody says the words, V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol modecha, and you will love the Lord your God with all of your mind, with all of your desire, with all of your means. And a person doesn't feel it. So if you say it and you don't feel it, you're in pain. He says that pain is the punishment. And the way to avoid that pain is to focus on feeling it. Or, he says, when a person is saying Kabbalah Shabbos, the welcoming of the Shabbos, and he says, says, come welcoming the Shabbos, besimcha uvitzahala, with happiness and with a delight, and you don't feel the happiness and delight, then you're missing out. Then you're saying something which indicates where you should be, and you're not there. That in itself is a sin. There are kama v'chama. There are many other examples of a person becoming unhappy with himself because of the sin, and that in itself is a punishment. There are others where a person is subject to an overt divine punishment, and this hefsek, says Rav Schwab, is to show that there are really two different types of punishment, if you will, of negative consequences to sin. And some of them, if we realize it, just require a little bit of focus and a little bit of change of attitude for us to turn that sense of distance from God, katinok haboreach mi beis hasefer, like a child in school who's running from school, whereas if you run from Kedusha, you distance yourself. One distances oneself from Kedusha, from holiness. And the closeness to holiness, which many, perhaps most of us feel on Yom Kippur, as the emblematic moment of closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if we can hold on to that, rather than running away from it, we will have the reverse of the punishment. We will have the pleasure and the satisfaction of the closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that comes about as a result of deliberately staying in proximity to Kedusha, is holding on to Shabbos, it's holding on to Yom Tov, it's holding on to Limud Torah, to the study of Torah. It's to all the things that create Kedusha. That in itself, even though we say Schar Mitzvah B'Hayal Maleka, that the reward for a mitzvah does not exist in this world, it means the ultimate reward. But there's nevertheless a satisfaction from learning Torah. The Iglai Tal talks about it in his introduction, that in itself creates a state of bliss and pleasure that a person can get that is specifically the opposite of Ketino Kaborech Mi Beis. Sometimes Kedusha is its own reward. Have a good Shabbos.